I am Daniel Ligis, and welcome to Book 101. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today, I have my special guest. He's one of the best horror author.
Hello, hello. Thanks for having me.
Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Roberts. And can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So, my name is Nick Roberts, and I am a horror author primarily, although I do write outside of the genre uh, sometimes. But my first book was Anathema, and that came out in 2020 and won an award for debut novel of the year. And then I hooked up with Crystal Lake Publishing in 2021 and wrote The Exorcist House, which came out last May, and um, kind of became a viral sensation through Facebook and TikTok and Instagram, and it ended up becoming Crystal Lake Publishing's best-selling novel to date. And it's spawned a sequel that I literally just started writing 2 days ago, and I was writing that. I was writing some of it just moments before jumping into this podcast. So yeah, I'm currently in the works of the sequel, and I also have a new short story collection coming out June 16th of this year.
Wow, congratulations!
Thank you.
What an achievement indeed. So, Mr. Roberts, The Exorcist House, how did you crafted it?
So, I was born in 1986. When I was, around 8 or 9 in the early 90s, I had a cousin who owned a farm, and he's a much older cousin, but he owned a farm in West Virginia. And I remember going out to this farm, and it seemed like the most, sprawling beautiful farmland, but it's through the eyes of a child, and I'm relying on my memory, so it could have just been 1 acre. Who knows? But he had a unique farmhouse, and that image of that farmhouse is sort of seared in my memory. And after writing Anathema, my first book, which it dealt with addiction, and it dealt with um, really a more adult themed horror. It was dark in tone. And with The Exorcist House, I wanted it to be a little not not necessarily less scary, but lighter in tone. And I decided that with those two goals of having a more of an entertaining thrill ride with my second novel, and being fascinated with setting a story in this farm in the 90s, those two ideas kind of came together and formed the basis for which I built my story from. So I had a 1990s farmhouse, and I was ready to go with a roller coaster ride through hell. And the next step was just to build out the characters and see what happened from then. But because I don't outline my novels, so it was just as exciting for me writing that book as it was for my fans who enjoyed reading it.
You are the writer called Gardiner.
Yes.
Oh, that'd be awesome. The Exorcist House was behind the title of the novel.
Yes. So um, the story is that the Hill family, they live in southern Ohio, and they decide that Daniel Hill, the father of the family, he's a psychologist, and he has a little bit of expendable money, and he decides that he wants to buy a farmhouse down south in rural West Virginia because he learned of a big chemical plant that's opening up there and bringing tons of jobs. And he notices that this farmhouse is going up on auction for really cheap, and knows that if he buys it at auction and decides to flip it over the summer and make all the renovations, make it look nice and pretty, that come fall he can make a quite a large profit and buy a dream house for his wife Nora and his daughter Alice. So they buy this farmhouse at the beginning of the novel, and they move down there, and their goal was to renovate it over the summer. And it's by no means a permanent home, but they feel like they'll enjoy the country life and the bonding experience of fixing up the house. And then Daniel stumbles into the basement and discovers a secret room. And inside that secret room is a boarded up well that's adorned with crucifixes. And then they learn of a local legend that the previous owner of that house was an exorcist.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Who influenced you in your writing, Mr. Roberts?
So early on, I guess in childhood, what got me into horror and writing was R.L. Stein's Goosebumps series, and then the scary stories to tell in the dark. Those terrified me with their black and white ink drawings. And then I remember finding my first Stephen King book almost by accident. I was walking. I was young. I was a kid, and I was walking in our library, which was a two-story building, and all the children's books were on the second floor. So I kind of veered right away from my parents and walked through the general adult fiction section just on a whim. And I noticed that the K section um, was right there at my eye level, and there was this little thin red book kind of protruding out from the shelf. And I pulled it out, and it looked like a comic book, and it said "Creep Show" by Stephen King. And I opened it up, and sure enough, it was a comic book, and it had these horrifying drawings, and I saw cuss words in it, and I was blown away uh, that I felt like I was looking at something that was part of the adult world, something I wasn't meant to see yet. But I remembered that name, Stephen King, and he stuck with me. So I guess in high school, I really kind of sat down and read my first actual Stephen King novel, which he was writing under the pen name Richard Bachman. But The Long Walk was my first Stephen King novel, and I got hooked from that point on with Pet Cemetery and The Shining and It. And yeah, as I've gotten a little older, I've expanded my palette with horror authors. I still read Stephen King books, obviously, but I've gotten into the indie horror scene. There are so many authors that people just don't know about because they're not being published by the big publishing houses. But this indie horror scene and other genres in the indie writing world are sort of blowing up right now, and it's thanks to social media and readers and word of mouth. And I've discovered so many great authors like John Durgan and Felix Blackwell, Sammy Scott, um, Gage Greenwood. These are guys that I just would never have heard of had I not been connected with them through social media. But I would say when I sat down to write my first novel, Anathema, the biggest influence was Clive Barker because he wrote Books of Blood is one of my favorite. Well, it's definitely my favorite short story collection, but it's one of my favorite books of all time. And he had been interviewed on that book, and I think he mentioned something about um, if you're going to write horror, and you must write unapologetically, or it's going to come off as being disingenuous. So when I wrote Anathema, that was my goal, was to tell a true story. Well, it wasn't necessarily a true story, but a story that is true to the characters. And if when it gets to the scenes that are dark and disturbing, to not shy away from it. If it serves the narrative, it belongs in there. But if it doesn't serve the narrative and you're just going for shock value, that's one thing. But I'm for going to that dark place as long as it serves the narrative and writing it unapologetically. So I would say Clive Barker, Stephen King, and definitely William Peter Blatty are the three biggest influences on my writing.
Very well said, Mr. Roberts. If you describe their writing, what are they or what is it?
So Stephen King, what I would take from him, or what I would try to emulate from him, is the warmth that kind of just comes off of the pages of his prose. He writes characters that within 2 pages you feel like you know them. You feel like you've known them your whole life. And he brings the horrors of, you know, all over the world. He brings cosmic horrors, and he brings those horrors into the home, into Main Street, to where you feel like, at least as an American in West Virginia, uh, I would feel that this could happen to me. This isn't, Count Dracula in a faraway castle in Transylvania. So this is something, a horrific monster that could happen, just right down the road. But Stephen King's, um, how prolific he is something else that's admirable. Um, that kind of work ethic and dedication. He wrote the book on writing, and my advice to any writer out there who doesn't know where to start is to read the book on writing. And because he discusses his love for writing, his techniques, and that's where I picked up my technique of writing 1,000 words per day, no matter what, until I get that thing cranked out. But yeah, so for Stephen King, it's definitely his relatable characters and setting the horror in a contemporary, relatable world. Um, with Clive Barker, it's his prose, it's his ability to describe the grotesque using the most poetic and beautiful language that I've ever read. And when I was in college, as part of an undergrad, as my capstone for my undergrad in English, I wrote a capstone paper on posthumanism and abjection in Clive Barker's novella *The Hellbound Heart*. So when I say that I'm a diehard Barker fan, especially his earlier works, I've I've definitely put the hours into studying his material, and yeah. So I
That's
guess
yes, that'd be awesome, Mr. Roberts. So, according to Amazon, your book is categorized in occult fiction ebooks and occult horror fiction. You're at number 195 and 276. Congratulations. And why this book is categorized as an occult?
that's just the way the Amazon rankings, or not the rankings, but the categories are a bit limited in the drop down menu options that they have. Now, I have learned that you can email Amazon directly and say that you want a more refined category that's more reflective of your title, which I plan on doing with these upcoming books that I have. But as far as it being a, occult horror, um, it's because there are definitely elements of the occult in the Exorcist house. With Anathema, it's a bit more ambiguous, but uh, it still veers occult enough to warrant that classification. And when the Exorcist house came out a year ago, we hit that number one spot in those ratings, and I've been grinding it out to try to keep engaged with my fans, sell author copies, do promotions and giveaways to keep that title as relevant and in that top count, in that top, you know, few thousand on the Amazon rankings as possible, because I know if I'm not out there trying to spread the word about it, it's you know it's just gonna eventually just
Fade away.
yeah.
Yes. Promotion must be consistent, as they said.
Yes, without being annoying.
Yeah. Without being annoying. That's true. According to Hannah Kadhim, original take on the genre. How did you put in the story to make your story this number one, let's say, original from Mr. Roberts? It's your trademark.
So I was I was a reader first, and a fan, a lover of horror books and movies first and foremost. So it would be very difficult for me to go into a writing project and try to forget everything that has influenced me up until this point. Now, I didn't consciously have any book or movie in mind when I sat down to write The Exorcist House. I knew that to be it was going to be supernatural. It was going to involve something supernatural happening to this family moving into this farmhouse, and it was going the supernatural happening was going to be directly tied to a well in their basement, because I lived in real life. I lived next to a guy who had a historic home, and in his basement he had this well that he sent me. He took a picture of it with his phone and sent it to me, and he knows I'm a horror writer. He said, "Hey man, I just saw this well in my basement. I took this picture and just thought it might generate a idea for you." And once I saw that creepy looking well, and I just thought, you know, The Exorcist is the scariest novel and movie, in my opinion, and I would love to have some lovable characters encounter a situation where they're faced with something demonic, and not go the traditional route of having the child get possessed by a demon and tied up to a bed and getting priests to come and save the day. I wanted it to be more than that. I wanted the narrative to be different than that. Now, in my book, I have elements of those things in there, but that's not the beat for beat plot. It definitely fulfills the possession subgenre requirements, but I've heard people say that it reminds them of books like, obviously, The Exorcist, but the Amityville Horror, movies like It Follows and Rosemary's Baby, and I can definitely see how people would um, how people would connect those, but they were definitely not on my mind as I was writing it. I did name the main character, well, not the main character, but the exorcist who in the prologue. I mean, this isn't a spoiler because he dies in the prologue and it's kind of listed in the synopsis. But that exorcist, his name is Merle Blatty, and that's, obviously a direct me paying homage to uh, William Peter Blatty, who wrote the original Exorcist. So I definitely wanted to give him some praise in the novel. But me just sitting there writing and trying to creep myself out is my primary method for whether or not I'm succeeding in what I'm trying to do, which was to creep out the reader. Because, I'm watching the movie in my head as I type it. And if I start getting chill bumps at a certain thought that I have, I'm like, oh yeah, that's good. I'm gonna keep that in there. And I definitely don't want to try to regurgitate or repeat what's already been done. But I'm also a super fan, and it's hard to take those genre tropes out of me because I love them so much. They're tropes because they work. People love them.
Yes, very well said, Mr. Roberts. But before we go on, I want to shout out to the people listening in one of the Scandinavian countries, Norway. So thank you so much, Norway. In Oslo County, I got 55% audience share. Buskerud at 13%, Rogaland at 6%, Viken at 6%, Mar Ogramsdal at 6%, Vestfold at 3%, Inlandet at 3%, Westland at 3%, and Trondelag at 3%. Thank you so much for supporting this podcast because this podcast is created to empower writers all over the world, like Mr. Nick Roberts. So, Mr. Roberts, according to one of your readers, well written, but did not live up with the hype. What can you say about that?
That's one phrase that you know I I'm kind of indifferent to, and I've grown thick skin when it comes to negative reviews or even just constructive criticism. It says um, didn't live up to the hype.
So,
That's
so do you think negative reviews make you better in the process?
it can. I typically don't read the Amazon reviews. I'm in a bunch of Facebook groups where people will review the book, and the review will pop up on my news feed. But like didn't live up to the hype. I understand that because I've certainly been recommended books that have everyone has said, "Oh, you've got to read this. It's the scariest thing I've ever read." And with that hype built in my mind, I'll pick it up thinking it's the scariest book I've ever read and go into it and be like, oh, well, no, I don't really agree with that. I don't think it lived up to the hype. So I get that. If a stand-up comedian is about to go on stage and the person before him says, "You're about to hear the funniest person in the world," that puts a lot of that puts a lot of
Yes.
pressure on the comic who's about to come out. But had that reader who made that comment read that book, going in blind, not knowing anything about it, they may have had a different experience, maybe not. I've certainly had negative reviews and people who did not care for the book or thought it was too derivative of books and films that have come before it, and that's okay. That's their prerogative. I definitely have my tastes, and I can appreciate it when someone. I just like when people give my book a chance and they give an honest review.
Definitely, because you cannot all please people, right?
Right.
There will be somebody will give comments on your work, whatever it is, how beautiful or how well written it is. They're gonna find something that they want to, in their mind, this book is not right or whatever. But thank you for the comments, because the comments make you better and better and more books to come. And according to Shawnee Robertson, was everything I wanted it to be and more. Oh, they want more, Mr. Roberts.
Yes, so well, they're definitely going to get more. And in this short story collection, I have it's called "It Haunts the Mind and Other Stories," and it comes out June 16th. And um, most of the stories in there have been previously published in other horror anthologies. Some were published in literary magazines because not all of the stories in that 15 story collection are horror, but I'd say five of them are definitely not straight horror, but they are all dark and they all deal with obsession. And one of the new stories that is in there is a direct tie-in to the Exorcist house. So I just released the cover art, not the full finished cover yet, but I released the cover art I think the day before yesterday for the collection. And the cover art was inspired by the Exorcist house story that's in there. And that story is called "It Haunts the Mind." It's the title story of the collection. So I know a lot of people have been wanting me to write more in the Exorcist house universe, and I think they'll be pleased with this story. And I also think it'll tide them over enough until the Exorcist House Genesis, which is a prequel sequel hybrid. Um, it's being published by Crystal Lake Publishing, and it comes out in mid 2024. So I think that's what I was typing literally moments before jumping on this podcast. So I'm I, I'm hoping I can deliver more than what I did with the first Exorcist House and really live up to the hype, because now the pressure's on. You know, it's gotten good reviews. It made the top 10 on the preliminary ballot for the Bram Stoker Award, but it didn't make it to the final five nominations. But it got a lot of good reviews. It sold a lot of copies, and I've definitely got to put the work in to make it as good a
Time.
book as the readers deserve.
Yes, one of the best and become timeless. Do you think you'll be the next Mr. Steven?
That's I think his shoes are way too big to ever be fulfilled by anyone. I don't think there will ever be another Stephen King. Just solely based not only on his literary work, but his footprint on pop culture in general. I mean, even if people don't read Stephen King, they know who he is. They've seen a Stephen King movie. Even if people don't read Stephen King or watch Stephen King horror movies and claim they've never seen Stephen King, and then you say, "Well, have you seen the Shawshank Redemption?" Well, yeah. Did you know that's written by Stephen King? Oh, really? Have you seen The Green Mile? What about Stand By Me? And then, he's just everyone knows who Pennywise the Clown is. He's there will never be another one like him, because one of how prolific he was with how many books he puts out and continues to put out, and two, the quality of those books, the influence he's had on every other writer since him, not just horror writers. Um, I believe he's elevated other writers' prose, and I have no illusion of ever trying to to shoot for that goal. I'd rather be the first Nick Roberts than the second Stephen King.
Wow, very well said, Mr. Roberts. And according to Amazon, you have 2,290 global ratings, and uh, 49% are 5 star. So imagine. So this book is one of phenomenal a horror book. So The Exorcist is good for a series or good for a motion picture.
Yes, I actually have had the motion picture rights um, optioned, and we're uh, we're working to get that made into a movie because my goal in writing my first book and this book as well is to have them adapted into movies. They're not they they're basically 3 act chamber pieces set in one location for the most part. They could be easily filmed for a low budget, and um, I think the way I write, because I fell in love with screenwriting before prose writing. The way I write is more cinematic. When I'm writing, like I said, I'm seeing a movie in my head, and I'm dictating what I'm seeing, and I'm just trying to write down the images that I'm seeing. So I write visually, and that's what a lot of my readers have responded to. Is they said, "I like your writing style because I feel like I can see what's happening in my head," and ultimately that's great. And my goal of getting these translated into films, because like you were referring back to Stephen King, I don't know that there would be a Stephen King phenomenon had he not sold his first novel, Carrie, to have it adapted by Brian De Palma and made into one of the best horror movies ever made. And in interviews, he's even said that he credits Brian De Palma with his entire career. So that one great adaptation of a book could create a make or break a career, really. So I'm all both of my novels have had the movie rights optioned, and we're trying to get deals made, but it's like winning the lottery. You just got to put the work in and hope for the best, and that's where I'm at with it right now.
Definitely. Dream big, as they said, Mr.
A-
Roberts.
Absolutely.
So, The Exorcist House. What do you think the flaws?
The biggest, by far, cri- the most criticism I got from the Exorcist house was there's a dog character in the book, and he's a primary character. He's a bloodhound, and he belonged to the exorcist who died in the prologue of the book. So when the new family moves into the farm, the dog shows up, and they sort of take him in, and he's a central character throughout the rest of the story. Now, this isn't a spoiler or anything like that, but in the end, I don't mention, I don't directly spell out word for word what happens with the dog. I heavily imply what what happens with the dog, and I felt like any reader with common sense would understand what happened. But that was me putting too much expectation on the readers, because I like, if you scroll through a bunch of those Amazon reviews, you'll see some, there may be 1 star reviews where it's like, great story, but what happened with Buck? And that's the name of the dog. Or, I did not get significant closure with Buck. And that would be the one negative out of so many reviews. And I kick myself because I'm like, I just needed to add one sentence in there, and it would have, you know, fixed all of that. So that's one thing I'm not going to do with with the sequel slash prequel is I'm definitely going to try to not leave any strings dangling.
Yes. If you want to revise the book itself, which part of the book you want to revise?
There's a scene where, and again, if you haven't read it, this is kind of a minor spoiler, so beware. But there's a scene where the daughter Alice, she is she is seeing another character, that a teenage boy, Luke, who's a local in the town, and she's seeing his ghost, and he is showing her what happened before they moved in the house. He's showing her what happened to his girlfriend, and it was actually a botched exorcism, and his girlfriend died. So we learn that about Luke, kind of, little more than halfway into the novel. But the way I wrote that scene, it was a bit fantastical. It was a bit like Alice falling down, the Alice in Wonderland, Alice falling down the rabbit hole and landing in this time warp, and it just felt out of place to me now, looking back on it, and I would have tweaked that scene a little differently than that. I tried to keep it as grounded in reality as I possibly could, and the way I wrote that scene, for me, it made it too fantastical, and took me out of the story. But a lot of readers like that, so, but that's just one thing I would change.
Yes, very well said, Mr. Nick. So before we go on, I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our third season with Chef Alessandro, one of the executive chef in one of the five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. Plus one more, I have this upcoming podcast called Comedy 101 with one of the best comedian of all time, Mr. Mike Lucas. So please do listen this coming June, Comedy 101. Mr. Roberts, indie or traditional?
Um, so my first book was published by an independent publisher, like I even hesitate to say an indie publisher. This was more of a micro publishing house. I just submitted my manuscript. There was very little editing done. When the physical copy of the book was formatted, that was poorly done. I remember getting the first shipment of the physical copies of the books, and I opened it up, and the margins were just completely off. Like on the left side of the page, it would look fine, but on the right side of the page, like all of the text would be right in the center of the book, and it'd be very difficult to read. And it just didn't have a good aesthetic. So I knew that with my second book, I wanted to aim a little higher and try to get a more professional editing job done. So with the Exorcist House, I sold that to Crystal Lake Publishing because they were a bigger independent publishing house, and they had just won the Bram Stoker Award for Best Indie Publisher. And you know, they took my book, and I had my first experience with professional editors, and I grew thick skin going through that process, because I expected to send in my work and have them praise it and say, "Oh, this is so great." Very few grammar flaws here and there. No, there was one comment, and I'll always remember this. There's one comment that said, and this is the part where I throw the book in the trash. and, and I said, you know, okay, there might be something here I need to take a look at. So I also learned that when you're taking editorial advice, you do not have to take all editorial advice. You know, you are the author, you're the creator. If it goes against your gut, you don't have to go with it. But yeah, in working with Crystal Lake and working with that independent publishing house, yeah, I've had nothing but a fantastic experience with them. That's why I've continued my relationship working with them and building myself up to be more of a partner with the publishing house than just an author submitting my stories. Having said that, I do have another novel that I've written that I've submitted to various agents, and I'm waiting to hear feedback. And that novel is called Mean Spirited. It's not tied to the Exorcist house in any way whatsoever. But if I ever want to get into that traditional publishing world where it's you know the big publishing houses where you walk in any Barnes and Noble or Books a Million or any other major retailer and you see the top 10 new releases. If I ever want to have a book put out by Simon and Schuster or Penguin, um, I would need an agent because they don't accept unsolicited manuscripts. So, as much as I dream of being a full time writer with a traditional publisher, I am more than happy and content with working with in the independent scene because I've seen other independent authors who have become more successful than some of the quote unquote mainstream authors you see out there. Um, so I love reading both. So I'm glad both worlds exist.
Yes, that'd be awesome. So, what are your short term and long term goals in writing?
My short term goal right now is to over the next 3 months finish the second Exorcist House book and get get it put out and released next year, mid 2024. Long term goals: um, continue this series, put out books that aren't related to this series, and ultimately get into the filmmaking industry. Get these books adapted. I'd love to try my hand at screenwriting. So yeah, long term, my first love was movies. My first love was screenwriting. So long term is to get into that industry.
That'd be awesome. So, if you love movies, can you will be my guest on my movie 101 and let's talk about the movies that you like.
Oh, I'd love to.
Yes, and then we gonna promote your books over there too.
That
Yeah.
sounds great.
Yes, so Mr. Roberts, can you please invite our listeners to buy all your books?
Absolutely. So I guess the hub of where you can find all my books and social media links would be my website, and that is www.nickrobertsauthor.com. And that's whenever I do have signed copies of Anathema or The Exorcist House or any other books in stock, that's where you can order those from. I also recently developed a line of merchandise with Anathema, and Crystal Lake also put together a lot of merchandise for the Exorcist House. So all of that's on my website. You can also there are direct links to my social media platforms. I'm on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and it's my handle is always spooky WV as in West Virginia because that's where I'm from and that's where I typically write about. So facebook.com spooky WV, and yeah, I'm also on TikTok, Twitter, all that. So, and you can also sign up for my newsletter on my website. So, hit the website. You can find anything you want related to me. And again, it's www.nickrobertsauthor.com.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Nick Roberts because if you support him, he will give more books to come. Okay, Mr. Roberts, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Moricon people, see you soon.